Well, it was only 15 seconds long, but what did you just think? When the screen changed and you didn't see the pictures of places we'd been or the normal picture of me saying, "Welcome to Fizz," when the black screen with the red letters and the snapping of pictures came on the screen, and that word, just 3 letters. But today's lesson from Proverbs 5 is about that one word. You see, the Bible deals with it pretty boldly, pretty clearly. And yet the word itself is not a bad word. Probably every application, every form that you fill out, even if you took your driver's license out of your wallet, you'd see that it asks the question, sex. What is your sex? Are you male or are you female? I guess in today's world, we almost have to put other, but nevertheless, it's not a dirty word. And it's a word that needs to be discussed. And today, Solomon decides to tell his sons some very important lessons about that word, sex. He deals with it pretty boldly, pretty straightforward. We don't know if most of what he had to say came from lessons from his father, David. Probably nobody better understood God's design for sex and the disastrous results of a distorted picture of sex than David himself. After all, didn't he pen in Psalm 51, "My sin is ever before me. My sin is ever before me." And at the same time, we know that Solomon, having learned many lessons from his father, and certainly many lessons in his own life, having penned Song of Songs, understood the beauty within the bonds of God's guidance, within the bonds of God's plan, design. It can be a beautiful thing. It's something that we need to talk to our children about, just as Solomon did here. We need to talk to each other about, so that we would keep God's design as it should be, as he really designed it. So, what is it all about? What does this proverb really say about the subject of sex? There's no question that Solomon wanted his sons to learn some important lessons and to be warned that God's design is the only design that will work properly in the subject of sex. I think there's a couple things that we need to realize. When we look at the scriptures, we recognize that it's not very far into the scriptures before we come across sex. You see, we only have to go in a couple of verses before it says, "And he made them male and female." Yes, we only have to look at chapter 1, verse 22 of the book of Genesis, where he has made the animals, the creatures of the earth, and he tells them to multiply. By the time we reach verse 27 of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, we find that he created man and female, and he tells them the same thing, multiply. God's plan, God's design was for procreation, but not only procreation. But nevertheless, we don't have to look very far when creating the whole heavens and the earth. Only 22 verses, 27 and 28 verses, before we find God actually asking the animals and man to procreate. By the time we get to chapter 4, we actually find the act of sex. We find in chapter 4, verse 1, that Adam had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived. It's not a dirty thing. It's not a sensuous thing that has to be banned from the public. It's clear that Adam and Eve became one flesh. And within God's design, God's plan, they enjoyed sex, and they had the benefits of procreation through sex. But it wasn't very far into the book of Genesis before we found sex became perverted. In chapter 6, verse 4, it tells us that man and angels perverted sex. It tells us in Genesis 19 that man perverted sex. We know all through the scriptures and even the early chapters of scriptures that man has the ability to either stay within God's plan or to pervert sex. So let's take a look at an outline that John Phillips used to introduce chapter 5 in Solomon's instruction to his son. You see, the chapter breaks are not what were inspired by Scripture. They were done during the canonization of Scriptures. So let's take a look at John Phillips. I think he does a masterful job in leading into chapter 5 with just a couple of verses from chapter 4. So we're going to start chapter 4, verse 23, and take a look at see what Solomon advised his son about the subject of sex. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. Put away from your deceitful mouth and put devious speech far from you. Let your eyes look directly ahead and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn your foot from evil. My son, give attention to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding. I tried to put some extra emphasis on the words that I'm sure you heard me put the emphasis on. First of all, we have the need to have a certain heart, certain to know God's design for sexual relationships. Second, we need to have cautious mouths. We need to be careful what we say if we don't want to fall into the trap that the Solomon is trying to warn us about here. We need to be sure that we have not only a cautious mouth and a certain heart, but we need to be sure that we have centered eyes. We need to keep our eyes on the things of God and not the things of this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We need to have controlled feet. We need to be careful where we walk and what we do and how we conduct our lives. And we need to have consecrated ears. Now, listen to how that ties into what we've been talking about. We've talked about knowledge, that is having information. We've talked about wisdom, that is knowing that the knowledge is important and it is true. And then understanding is having the ability to choose the right things based on the knowledge and wisdom that we have. And so we have this wonderful lead in, if you will, to chapter 5, rather, verse 1, which is a certain heart, a cautious mouth, a centered eyes, and controlled feet, and a consecrated ear. That's what Solomon wanted. He wanted his sons to have a consecrated ear, to hear the wisdom that he was about to impart to them. The knowledge and wisdom would be something he could pass on. However, the understanding was something that they had to have. And so when we look at chapter 5, verse 1, he says, my son, give attention to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding. Solomon had the understanding, and he wanted his boys to have the understanding. So let's take a look at the next section of Scripture. That you may observe discretion, and your lips may reserve knowledge. For the lips of an adulteress drip with honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. Solomon wants them to have the knowledge so that they'll be able to make the right decisions, have the right understanding when these things occur. Notice what he says about an adulterous woman. He says that she has smooth speech, like honey, like oil, and that one of the things you have to be careful of is that There is great danger in listening to her speech. And you need discernment, you need wisdom, you need this knowledge in order to be able to stand against it. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. She does not ponder the path of her life. Her ways are unstable, and she does not know it. Bitter as wormwood. A number of years ago, Canada Dry came out with a drink that was supposed to be bitter. Somehow I confused bitter with tart. I love tart things. The tarter, the better. Bitter is totally different. So I bought some of this soda thinking that I was going to like it, thinking that it was going to be tart, but it truly was bitter. Instead of being tart like a lemon, it was bitter like actually eating the rind of a lemon. And so it was a terrible taste in my mouth. So when I looked at this and I said to myself, her words are like wormwood and bitter to the taste. Then it also says that it's sharper than a two-edged sword. I don't know about you, but I've cut myself lots of times on something that was super sharp. But can you imagine having something that's super sharp on both edges? Well, that's exactly how she is. She's bitter. She's not sweet or tart. She's bitter. And she's sharper than a two-edged sword. You can really get hurt playing around with a two-edged sword. And it's certainly not very pleasant when you get into some bitter things. It says that her feet go down to death, and her steps lay hold of Sheol. Now, we need to understand that maybe there weren't as many sexually transmitted diseases back then as there are now. But there's no question that we can quickly say that today, if you were to be involved with an adulteress, a loose woman, a prostitute, that one of the things that might happen is that you might wind up with a lot more than what you thought you were going to get. That is, you might wind up with sexually transmitted disease, even possibility of AIDS, which could lead to death. And so the consequences that Solomon wanted these boys to understand was that although her lips may be filled with words of honey and smooth as oil, the end result of being involved with her might easily lead to death, and that she wasn't stable. She wouldn't stay sweet and smooth, that she might really hurt you like a two-edged sword. She might really be bitter like wormwood. Let's take a look at the next passage. Now then, my sons, listen to me, and do not depart from my words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. Or you will give your vigor to others, and your years to the cruel one. And strangers will be filled with your strength, and your hard-earned goods will go to the house of an alien. And you groan at your final end, when your flesh and your body are consumed. Verse 7 is like a lot of us fathers have said to our children, one more thing. He says, now listen, don't depart from this. Stay away. Don't even go by our door. Remember last week, I believe it was, we talked about an alcoholic who wound up falling back into alcohol again because he went by the bar that he used to patronize, and his friend told him, you just can't go down that street. Well, that's exactly what Solomon's telling these boys. He says, stay away. Don't even go near her door. Don't even flirt with her. Don't do any of those things. And remember, if you do, you lose your respect, your honor, your dignity, your finances, a lot of your friends, and even perhaps your physical health. Now, 1 John 2, verse 16 says that Everything in the world comes into three different kinds of temptation and sin: lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And that's so absolutely scripturally sound. If I just take a look at the scriptures for each of those, the lust of the eye. You remember Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28 said, even if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery. Or if we think about the lust of the flesh, how about James 1:14 and 15, which tells us the progression of sin. But each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. It starts out when we're tempted because we're tempted by our own lusts. And when our lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. We actually act on it. And then when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. So we have the lust of the eye. Jesus says, don't even look at a woman with any kind of lustful thoughts. Lust of the flesh, which is conceived within ourselves, and we act on it, and that brings forth death. And then finally, the pride of life. Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. If we think that we can't be tempted, we make a terrible mistake. We all can be tempted. In the right circumstances, in the right situations, we all can be tempted. And if we're not careful, if we don't listen to what Solomon's advice is, that we don't even get near the door, if we just stay away, we'll not have the consequences found in verses 10 and 11, which is to lose our respect, lose our honor, lose our dignity, and even our financial resources will belong to somebody else. I know as a pastor, so many times I've seen it happen. A man or a woman is unfaithful, commits adultery, and as a result, there's a divorce. As a result of that, there's loss of respect in the community. Alimony has to be paid. There's tremendous financial hardship on the part of everybody involved. The dignity is gone, all for a few minutes of pleasure, all for falling to temptation, and the end being destruction. Well, it's really a sad state of affairs, isn't it? When we don't listen to the wisdom of Solomon and Proverbs. But he not only tells us what to stay away from, he tells us what we should do within the marriage relationship. Remember, this whole message is about God's design. God said in the beginning, it wasn't good for man to be alone, that he'd make him a helpmate. And when Adam saw Eve, he said, wow, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And it said they had relations and they had children. You see, if you look at the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, and you look at the words there of someone that's deeply in love with their espoused, with their marriage partner, it's a wonderful relationship. It's one in which you can fully enjoy sexual relationships. It's not for just producing children. It's the intimacy of two people expressing their love in a physical form. And so let's take a look and see what Solomon says about the marriage relationship in contrast to this relationship of just lust. Drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be yours alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. Drink water from your own cistern, from your own well. And don't waste yourself on strangers. Take pleasure in your wife of your youth. I think there's a couple of sayings that I can remember when I was a young man. Not sure who all said them to me, but one was, why settle for stale bread when you have cake at home? I think you understand the implication. If you're out and you're looking at a loose woman, it's like stale bread when you have cake, good cake at home. Or somebody told me one time the grass always looks greener on the other side of the street. And the reason it does is there's a lot more fertilizer over there. Well, I think both of those statements are worth remembering as a man. The grass may look greener on the other side of the street, but my guess is you'll find that it's not as green as you think it is, and it's not as good as you think it is. And it may cost you your health and your pride and your respect and your relationship in the community. And my friends, even if for some reason you think that your wife is not as beautiful as someone that's 20 years younger, then just think of a few minutes about somebody being 20 years younger, taking a look at you 20 years older. I remember a story about a 60-year-old man who was married to a 60-year-old woman, and he was at the beach. He rubbed a little jar that he found on the beach, and a genie came out. He said, "Do I get 3 wishes?" And the genie said, "No, just 1. He thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, I'd like to be married to somebody that's 30 years younger than I am." The genie said, "Are you sure that's what you want?" He said, "Absolutely. I'd like to be married to somebody 30 years younger than me." The genie waved his magic wand, and poof, the man was 90 instead of 60. Listen to these 2 scriptures. Hebrews 13:4. Marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Or 1 Corinthians 7, verses 3 through 5. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the wife has the authority over her husband's body. Stop depriving one another except in agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come again, so that Satan will not tempt you because you lack self-control. There's so many passages of scripture that we could read about what God intended, what was his design for marriage. His design for marriage was for you to have a life and have it abundantly. I believe that with all of my heart. I believe that a man and a woman come together in marriage under God's design, and he designed it not only for producing children, but also for the greatest of intimacy and pleasure that a couple could possibly have. And we need to be sure that we understand what Solomon was writing to these young men. We need to understand not only the temptations of lust, but the price of lust, the price and the cost for being unfaithful. We need also to remember what a wonderful union we can have with our mates, and that God designed it that way. It's just a matter of us talking about it. It's a matter of us being sure that we're faithful to one another, and being sure that we resist the temptations that will always be around us. I know there's a lot of people that joke and they laugh and they say, well, the Bible also says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is so weak. Well, remember what Proverbs said here tonight. Proverbs said to us that we shouldn't even get near the door. We shouldn't allow ourselves to get into places of temptation. We shouldn't allow our head, our mouth, our ears, or our feet to get us into trouble, to bring about infidelity or perversion of what God designed for the sexual relationship between a man and a woman. I think it's really well that you go back and read through again. Now, our writer today stops at verse 18 because verse 19, I guess he thought it would just be a little too risque. But it really talks about the beauty of a marriage relationship and intimacy within marriage, God's design, God's plan for marriage. And we need to be sure that we understand clearly that Proverbs is written not only for those young men, but it's written for old men too. It's written for everyone who can still lust, because lust is a terrible, dangerous thing. And as I read to you a minute ago, the progression of lust leads to death. Now, I'm going to show you some clips of places we've been. I'm going to number them so that you can write me, call me, whatever you want to do, email me, whether or not you think you found any of these places or you know where these places are. Remember, the only person that's gotten them right is my daughter, who knows about our visitation travel plans and knows where we've been and seen all of the movies and pictures and been bored to death with them. And one other, Chris Owens, has been to Bouchard Gardens, and he's also been to Malamuth Falls in Oregon. Let's see how many of these you might be able to guess where they are. And again, I'm going to number them so you can say number such and such is such a place. So enjoy these pictures as I number them for you. I'll have them over my right-hand shoulder. And this is place number 1. This is place number 1. Place number 1. Place number 1. Place number 1. And this is place number 2. Place number 2, place number 2, this is place number 2, and this is place number 3, place number 3. Yes, we went to this place also. This is place number 3. This is place number 4, place number 4. Yes, we visited place number 4 as well. This is place 4. This is place number 5, place number 5. We had a good time here. Place number 5 is a good place to have a good time. Place number 6. We visited place number 6. It might have been a while ago, but we visited place number 6. This is place number 6. This is place number 7. Place number 7. Good place to visit. Everybody should be there at least once. Place number 7. And here's place number 8. Yes, place number 8. Do you know where this is? Place number 8. How about this one? Place number 9. This is place number 9. Do you know where place number 9 is? Have you recognized any of the scenery here? Place number 9. Place number 10. Place number 10. Do you recognize place number 10? Maybe you never visited there, but maybe you saw it in a catalog, or maybe you saw it in a magazine. Travelogue on TV. Place 10. Place number 11. Place number 11. Do you recognize place number 11? Recognize place 11? It's right here above my shoulder. Then there's place number 12. Place number 12. Do you recognize place number 12? Place number 12. Well, it was not unlucky for us, but this is place 13. Place 13. Do you recognize place 13? I hope you're having fun playing this game with us. Place 13. And here's place 14. Place 14. Place 14. Place 14. Place 14. The final one for this particular viewing will be place 15. Place number 15. Can you recognize this place? It's a good place.